Today we'll be doing the gummy bear experiment. And in the gummy bear experiment, we'll be using the scientific method. In the scientific method, we need a question and hypothesis. So let's get started. Our question is, will the color fade in all liquids in the gummy bear? And our hypothesis for the salt is that the color will fade away. And for the water, it would expand and also the color fades away. And for the vinegar, expand and color fade away. And the baking soda will get smaller and the color will fade. Step 1. Put the gummy bears into the jar. Step 2. Put the labels of the liquids on the jar. Step 3. Put the liquids in the jar. Step 4. Leave the gummy bears in the jar overnight.
24 hours later.
Step 5. Take it out and see if your hypothesis is correct. So we're going to start with the baking soda. The baking soda is very squishy. On day 1, the length for our baking soda was 3 millimeters, and that stayed the same. For the width on day 1 was 1 millimeter, and on day 2 it changed to 1.5. And the thickness was 1 millimeter on day 1, and on day 2 was also 1 millimeter. And the height stayed the same. Now let's move on to the salt with water. The salt felt a little bit mushy, but also pretty hard to break into, and the top layer was easy to scrape off, but the bottom layer was not. For the water with salt, on day 1 the length was 3 millimeters, and on day 2 it was the same. For the width, on day 1 it was 1 millimeter, and on day 2 it changed to 1.5. And for the thickness, it was 1 millimeter, and on day 2, it changed to 1.5. And the height stayed the same again. Moving on to the water. On day 1, the water was 3 millimeters, and on day 2, it was again 3 millimeters. Then on
day 1, the width of the water was 1 millimeter, and on day 2 was again 1 millimeter. Same thing for the thickness, it was 1 millimeter, and on day 2 it is 1 millimeter again. And the height grew from 1 to 1.5. Moving on to the vinegar. The vinegar had the most change. On day 1, the vinegar was 3 millimeters, and on day 2, the vinegar was 4 millimeters for the length. Then the width on day 1 was 1 millimeter, and on day 2 was 1.5. And thickness was 1 millimeter, and on day 2 was 2 millimeters. And then the height stayed exactly the same. Here's another cool science experiment. So it turns out that our main hypothesis, which was the color would fade away in all of the liquids, was correct.